Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
In 1880, José Ferreira de Menezes, the mulatto founder of the Brazilian abolitionist daily newspaper Gazeta da Tarde, hailed the American Civil War as a decisive turning point in the world's struggle against slavery, as well as in civilization's triumph over barbarism. Obtaining from a resident American a list of immortal abolitionist names to be honored as promoters of human progress, Ferreira paid tribute to William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Lucretia Mott, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Charles Sumner, and the Christ-like martyr Abraham Lincoln. Ferreira and his radical and fellow mulatto successor, José do Patrocinio, conveyed the image of a single worldwide abolitionist movement, originally inspired by such Britons as Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce, but including some Brazilians, such as the Pernambucan rebels of 1817. Even in Cuba, where there was much less abolitionist agitation in the 1880s, reformers made heroes of Wilberforce, Garrison, and Lincoln, while uneasily merging the legend of humanitarian Catholic precedents with anticlerical rationalism. And it was reported that some Cuban slaves in the field sang, "Avanza Lincoln, avanza, tú eres nuestra esperanza." Advance, Lincoln, advance. You are our hope. Yet the context within which emancipation took place could hardly have been more different in Cuba and Brazil than in the United States. In both Latin societies, abolitionists would almost daily pass slaves and slaveholders on the streets. There were no free soil states to the north, and no mother country across the Atlantic dedicated to anti-slavery policies. Because slave populations in both regions had strongly negative growth rates, both Cuban and Brazilian economies depended on a large and continuing importation of black slaves from Africa. The roughly 1.84 million Africans brought into Cuba and Brazil from 1820 to 1870 was nearly 4 times the total number of slaves imported into North America before the U.S. Prohibition of 1808. This mainly illegal slave traffic was greatly encouraged by rising slave prices in both Cuba and Brazil. In Rio de Janeiro, slave prices doubled from 1820 to 1850. The compelling need for slave labor put the Spanish and Brazilian governments in direct conflict with the British commitment to use naval power, even illegally, to suppress the oceanic slave trades, which ironically had the effect of increasing slave prices and profits from the slave trade. After some 2 decades of illegal importations, Brazil finally complied with British pressure in 1850, followed by Cuba 17 years later. While British abolitionists had originally assumed that ending their own slave trade would lead to the gradual abolition of British colonial slavery, and had then changed their minds, it can surely be argued that this shutting off of supply impaired the institution's longer-term prospects in both Cuba and Brazil. Both regions led the world in the production of slave-grown sugar after the destruction of French Saint-Domingue, and especially after Britain and France emancipated their slaves in 1834 and 1848, though Brazil increasingly concentrated its coerced labor on the production of coffee. Of course, much of Brazil was still unsettled by whites and sparsely occupied by Indians, and Cuba was far more densely populated. In 1862, there were about 368,550 slaves in Cuba, 27.1% of the total population, compared with 1,715,000 in Brazil in 1864, 16.7% of the population. A far more critical difference pertained to political rule. Brazil gained its independence from Portugal in 1822 and crowned Dom Pedro I as its emperor. Cuba, along with Puerto Rico, remained the last fragment of Spain's once great New World empire, and despite some anti-slavery stirrings among Spain's liberals, a strong Cuban and Spanish consensus ruled that the protection and maintenance of Cuban slavery, including the illegal slave trade, was the best barrier against movements for Cuban independence. Although the governments of Spain, Cuba, and Brazil were generally conservative, The British model of slave emancipation seemed to some liberals by the 1840s and 1850s to have forecast a global pattern of inevitable historical progress. If the European revolutions of 1848 brought catastrophic repression, they also brought permanent slave emancipation in the French and Danish colonies. Russia's abolition of serfdom in 1861 was followed 2 years later by Holland's gradual liberation of colonial slaves and by Lincoln's much-publicized Emancipation Proclamation. In Spain, Julio Vizcarrondo and other resident Puerto Ricans launched a small but genuine abolitionist movement late in 1864. In 1868, a liberal revolution in Spain coincided with an armed rebellion in eastern Cuba, far from the major slave plantations in the West, which became known as the 10 Years' War against Spanish rule. If the rebellion initially failed, it involved the arming and freeing of many blacks on both the Spanish and rebel sides. Hoping to win the support of Afro-Cubans, the Spanish Cortes passed a Gradual Emancipation Act in 1870, which freed all slaves at age 60 and older, and all children, patrocinados, born since September 18, 1868, the date when the Glorious Revolution began. Puerto Rico ended slavery in 1873 and a form of apprenticeship in 1876. Partly as a result of resistance by slaves and patrocinados, Spain abolished all colonial slavery in 1886. We should note that planters in Cuba and Brazil were confident even in the 1860s and 1870s that slavery would last for many more decades. Slave prices reflected this optimism, as in the American South at the beginning of the Civil War. Moreover, some Hispanic liberals were highly critical of the way Britain, and especially the United States, had emancipated their slaves without forethought or careful preparation. For example, the liberal Spanish historian Justo Zaragoza asserted that British hypocrisy had led to the disastrous results of emancipation in the British Caribbean, uprooting an idle class of blacks while leaving the land under control of white proprietors. Zaragoza and others also pointed to the anarchy of the Reconstruction in the American South, and warned that Spain must avoid such social disruption by ensuring a slow transition from slavery to freedom, a carefully planned process in which blacks would be gradually replaced by white immigrant labor. Initially, Brazil followed the gradualist example of most of the northern states in the United States. Most of the independent Hispanic American nations, where slavery persisted into the 1850s and 1860s, and even the Dutch colonies, where 10 years of apprenticeship, 1863 to 73, were intended to prepare slaves for freedom, while also reimbursing their owners. Even Brazil's Emperor Pedro II seemed to favor the 1871 Rio Branco law of free birth, which liberated all newborn children of slaves after the date of the law, but required them to work for the mother's owner until age 21. Yet slavery was so deeply entrenched in Brazil that pro-slavery legislators denounced the law as a crime, robbery, theft, and a communist plot, and at least until the 1880s most planters and even middle-class slaveholders looked upon abolitionism as a treasonous scheme instigated by the English and other hostile foreigners. Yet it was Britons who mainly financed Brazil's coffee boom, distributed its product, controlled major banks and insurance companies, and contributed to the building of railroads and even urban public utilities. Joaquim Nabuco, the elite parliamentary leader of abolitionism, who had been exiled in London and was a corresponding member of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, complained that any Brazilians who favored progress were branded as foreign agents. He also lamented that the free birth law led to another epoch of indifference for the fate of the slave, during which even the government could forget to comply with the law which it had passed. But with the debatable exception of France, Brazil was the only non-English-speaking country in which abolitionism developed as a mass movement. That said, the movement differed markedly from those in Britain and the United States, especially with respect to individual liberations and slave initiative. First, individual manumissions and the opportunity for slaves to purchase their freedom were far more common than in Anglo-America. Brazil's long war with Paraguay, from 1864 to 1870, brought a new need for arming and freeing blacks as soldiers, which further reduced the size of the naturally declining slave population. Then, in the far northeastern province of Ceará, a region of small farms, members of various social classes united to prevent slaves from being sold and transported southward. In 1883 and 1884, slaves were literally freed block by block and farm by farm as Cearense citizens raised funds to pay the slaves' owners. The sudden liberation of slaves in Ceará and then in Amazonas, to the northwest, where slaves were few, greatly inspired abolitionists throughout Brazil and helped legislators in 1886 to outlaw whipping as a punishment for slaves. Nevertheless, the prospering coffee planters in São Paulo province seemed determined to resist all anti-slavery measures until 1887, when slaves themselves took the initiative and began to flee the great coffee fazendas, farms. Nothing in the history of slavery, except in the Hebrew Bible, approximates this mass exodus of thousands of bondspeople, who had no invading army, as in the American Civil War, to give them shelter. Antonio Bento, a radical Pentecostal abolitionist, a Brazilian version of America's John Brown, encouraged slaves to escape and created a large secret network that provided shelter on trains and in shanty towns, and in some cases even found jobs for the runaways. Most important, the Brazilian police and armed forces proved unwilling or powerless to pursue the fugitives. Before long, the Paulista planters, who had been enjoying a wave of prosperity, became desperate over the prospect of a lost harvest and economic ruin. They began to free large numbers of slaves in return for service contracts that would keep them in the fields. As most planters came to accept the necessity of free labor, the province of São Paulo took the next step and officially freed all slaves through legislative action. As matters developed in 1888, more than 90,000 European immigrants, most of them poor and many of them Italian, settled in the province. This meant that emancipation did not bring the expected decline in plantation labor. When Brazil finally enacted immediate, uncompensated emancipation on May 13, 1888, there were days of public celebration of a kind not seen in the United States. Music, parades, flowers, banners, pageants, and a solemn Catholic Mass attended by Princess Regent Isabel. Her father, the Emperor, was away in Europe, and members of the government. Oddly enough, this royal sanction for slave emancipation enabled angry planters to join groups that had other reasons for staging a military coup d'etat and overthrowing the monarchic government. As in 1871, the reformers never seriously considered land redistribution and failed to provide any educational measures for the freed people. Like those in most of the Americas, former slaves were freed from the lash and other evils of inhuman bondage, but sank to the lowest levels of a stratified society. As my colleague Amelia Viatti da Costa has put it, the ex-slave was left to his own devices. His difficulties in adjusting to new conditions were taken by the elites as proof of his racial inferiority. Many ex-slaveholders went as far as to say that the blacks had been happier as slaves than they were as free men, since they were incapable of leading their own lives. Sadly, similar views became almost universal in post-emancipation societies throughout the New World, and have by no means been limited to the New World. The history of post-emancipation reconstructions is a vast subject that we cannot begin to explore in this book. In the first part of Chapter 15, I did argue that in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the South won the ideological Civil War by repressing the issue of slavery and the war's revolutionary character, and by winning command over a policy of segregation based on the ardent belief in white supremacy. The tragic collapse of America's post-war Reconstruction, which the racist North never seriously supported, led in the South to a long era of Jim Crow discrimination that relied, like slavery, on the fear and terror of institutionalized physical violence. This violence was not confined to vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan. First, as we saw in Chapter 2, with the lynching of Henry Smith in Paris, Texas, thousands of ordinary white men, women, and even children eagerly attended and endorsed the killing of wayward or designated blacks. These frequent mob executions seldom outraged the North, and as late as the 1930s, Southern Democrats, on whom the New Deal depended, succeeded in blocking anti-lynching legislation. A second form of institutionalized terror can be seen in the Southern prison system, which one of the best historians on the subject has termed worse than slavery. Many black males were incarcerated for very minor or trumped-up offenses, and Southern governors long rented out such convict labor to lumber companies, mining industries, and large-scale farms, where guards with shotguns, seated on mules or horses, gave orders to slave-like gangs of blacks in striped uniforms. That said, few slave emancipations in history have been followed by anything equivalent to America's first civil rights legislation and 14th and 15th Amendments, endowing former slaves with full citizenship and the right to vote. As a result of Reconstruction, a significant number of former slaves did vote, and many were elected to state legislatures. Between 1869 and 1901, 2 African Americans served in the U.S. Senate, and 20 in the House of Representatives. Moreover, in contrast to much of the Caribbean, the South's sudden post-emancipation drop in economic productivity was soon reversed and followed by rapid economic growth as white farmers began growing more cotton. Even more striking, many blacks succeeded in saving their earnings, and by the 1880s, a surprising number became owners of small farms. Yet despite this moderate economic recovery during the late 1870s and the 1880s, real wages in the South at the end of the century were no higher than they had been in the late 1860s. The small economic achievements with respect to land ownership were checked and partially reversed. By the early 20th century, most Southern white leaders would probably have agreed with a man in Tennessee who wrote, "As long as the Negroes are poor, they are all right. But as soon as they get some money, they get uppity." In 1900, an estimated 75.3% of black farmers in the South were sharecroppers or tenants, and 20 years later in the Mississippi Delta region, blacks constituted 86% of the farm tenants and only 2% of the farm owners. Nevertheless, the United States had established important precedents that contributed to later levels of opportunity. Indeed, it is highly significant that many black West Indian immigrants were attracted by such opportunities and enjoyed in America a kind of success that would have been impossible in the supposedly less racist Caribbean. As one surveys the outcomes of the multiple emancipations in the New World, nothing is more tragic than the fate of Haiti, once the richest spot in the hemisphere, and now for many generations the poorest, and yet the only slave society in human history in which the slaves bravely fought for and won their own liberation. Looking back from the first decades of the 21st century on 20th and early 21st century forms of slavery and coerced labor, we find grounds for some hope as well as discouragement. It is difficult in the wake of the past century to argue that human nature is perfectible, as many idealistic abolitionists believed. But major changes in moral perception have at least altered cultural norms, and some types of behavior have become almost universally unacceptable. Public whipping, for example, was an indispensable component of chattel slavery, and long seemed necessary for the discipline of even white people, from sailors on the decks of ships to children in public schools. While whipping and flogging are now condemned in most of the world, we have a wealth of evidence to show that humans are no less eager than in the past to dominate, degrade, humiliate, and control, often in order to confirm their own sense of pride and superiority. Adam Smith wrote in 1776 that this was the main motive for slavery. But in most of the world, laws have at least removed legal sanctions for fulfilling such desires by becoming the owner and master of chattel slaves. No doubt we will always have a small number of individual psychopathic torturers and serial killers. The worst evils arise when institutions encourage large numbers of ordinary people to adopt similar behavior and win approval and even admiration from, let us say, fellow guards at a Nazi death camp, or even at an American-run Iraqi prison. We are seldom willing to recognize the truth that every war converts normal and ordinary citizen soldiers into serial killers, often of so-called innocent civilians, as in the massive bombings of World War II. I say this having been rigorously trained to kill Japanese in the planned invasion in the autumn of 1945. For over 2 decades, the Garrisonian wing of the American abolitionist movement embraced radical pacifism and condemned slavery and war as the great twin evils. And we should recall that one classical defense of slavery found its origins in the humane sparing of life by the enslavement of a prisoner of war. But as the 20th century dramatically showed, the progressive outlawing of slavery did not strengthen global pacifism or diminish the horrors of war. In fact, in the last century's 2 world wars, the number of Europeans killed by other Europeans far exceeded the total number of Africans enslaved and shipped to the New World from the very beginning. The 20th century also set wholly new records for the mass extermination or genocide of selected groups, epitomized but by no means ended with the unprecedented Nazi Holocaust. The rise of such fascist and communist regimes, which used secular utopian ends to justify the most cruel and dehumanizing means, led to new forms of coerced labor that were often called slavery, even though the workers were in effect worthless prisoners who were not defined as property that could be owned, purchased, or inherited. In the 19th century, Frederick Douglass and some other former slaves and abolitionists understandably objected when people extended the term slavery to factory workers and other groups who, even if brutally exploited, were not deprived of membership in a family and did not pass on to their children an inherited status as private property. Scholars, reformers, and diplomats still debate the inclusiveness of the term slave. The issue has become more complex given the fact that the inmates of Soviet gulags or Nazi concentration camps were totally expendable in the eyes of the authorities. Chattel slaves, at least, represented a valuable investment, an investment of rising value in much of the New World. But that slightly protective aspect of chattel slavery was absent from 20th century state slavery, and does not apply to the many millions of bonded and coerced workers in today's so-called developing world. While traditional chattel slavery is still widespread in such Saharan nations as Niger, Mauritania, Chad, and Sudan, it is immensely overshadowed by what modern anti-slavery groups describe as new forms of slavery. The men, women, and children who are physically forced to work, often under the guise of meaningless contracts, in sweatshops or in building roads and pipelines for multinational corporations. Along with the exploitive use of indebtedness as an excuse for forced labor, there is also an enormous international traffic, especially in Eastern Europe and South Asia, in sex slaves, often girls or young women, who have volunteered for decent-sounding jobs only to find themselves being coerced into prostitution. I remember attending as a child the Chicago World's Fair of 1933, which celebrated a century of progress. The title was, of course, chosen before the stock market crash of 1929, and it hardly required a cynic to note that 1933 was a year of deep economic depression, and also the year when Hitler came to power. But as we have seen in this book, looking backward from 1933, only a century had elapsed since Britain's pioneering and peaceful emancipation of some 800,000 slaves, which helped lead the way to the outlawing of chattel slavery in much of the world. As I emphasized in the prologue, by 1888, a century after the founding of the first feeble anti-slavery organizations in Philadelphia, London, Manchester, and New York, slavery had been outlawed throughout the entire New World, a hemisphere whose economies had long depended on the labor of millions of Africans or people of African descent. While some of this amazing emancipation can be attributed to slave resistance, especially the fleeing of hundreds of thousands of slaves behind Union lines in the American Civil War, and the mass exodus of thousands of slaves from farms and plantations in Brazil in the late 1880s, slave resistance was far more striking at earlier stages in the history of the New World, for example, in the creation of large maroon societies or in the Haitian Revolution. It is surely certain as one can be about any historical events, that the fall of New World slavery could not have occurred if there had been no abolitionist movements. We can thus end on a positive note of willed achievement, a century's moral achievement that may have no parallel. It is an achievement, despite its many limitations, that should help inspire some confidence in other movements for social change, for not being condemned to fully accept the world into which we are born. But since we have devoted special attention to the origins and damage of anti-black racism, it is also crucial to add that we still face the heavy legacies of historical slavery throughout the Western Hemisphere, as well as in the still devastated continent of Africa. This concludes the reading of Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World, by David Bryan Davis.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.